Welcome to the Friday Independence Age briefing. It's very nice to be back in the driving seat today. So, where are we at? This time last year, the first COVID vaccine was approved for use in the UK, bringing hope of an end in sight to the pandemic. 12 months later, and we find ourselves anxiously awaiting to find out how well our existing vaccines are working against this new variant, Omicron, and whether, despite all the TV adverts egging us on, we may all have to be rather more cautious this Christmas. To help us navigate the latest findings on variants, vaccines, booster jabs, and COVID immunity, we're absolutely delighted to welcome guest expert Professor Sheena Cruikshank. Sheena's an immunologist at the University of Manchester, and she'll be talking to Professor Danny Altman later in our session. But first, I did want to say something about the industrial action taking place at many universities this week, which is about pensions and also about casualisation of the workforce, amongst other issues. Some members of IndieSage are not with us today because they've decided that this is too close to their university positions. Others feel that this public-facing work is outside their university roles, and so they're comfortable to be here. I'm part-time at a university, and so I consider my involvement to be outside that role, and that's why I'm here today. It's a very personal decision, but I know that all of us want to express our support for our striking colleagues and the reasons behind the strike. Now, university strikes inevitably affect students, so it's always a very difficult decision. But over the years, cuts to pensions, as well as the expansion of short-term contracts and insecurity of jobs, has had a huge effect, especially for younger academics starting out in their careers. And that really affects the student experience, both now and it will again in the future. The strike isn't just about paying conditions then, but about the future of higher education and university research. And the pandemic has shown us just how much we need independent scientists and scholars. On with today's Independence Age briefing then, and we start with the latest facts and figures from Professor Christina Pargle. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you for that. Right. So, welcome to today's briefing. I'm trying not to be too long because I want to leave plenty of time to talk to Danny and Sheena, but there is quite a lot to cover. So I'm just going to briefly go through cases, hospitalizations and deaths, and then the latest long COVID numbers, and then spend a bit of time on Omicron and kind of what we know and what we don't know, and then end on vaccinations because they're such a key step in protecting us from new variants. So cases, we recorded yesterday the highest number of new cases since July. There have only been a handful of days in the whole pandemic when we've recorded more than 50,000 cases, and yesterday was one of them. If we look at it by nation, this is by date of test, so it's a little bit behind. You can see that Northern Ireland is currently the highest, and then Wales, England, and Scotland. But just the most very recent days is that all countries are going up except Wales. And this matches the ONS report that came out today, which shows that the proportion of people testing positive is going up in England, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, and it's a bit less certain in Wales, but it looks like there might be a slight uptick. Regionally, in England, what we're seeing is that actually growth at the moment is being driven by London and the southeast, and that really has not been the case since a year ago. So you can see that London and southeast are going up, and actually other regions are flat or falling, and you see the same pattern in positivity rates as well. By age, we're still seeing that the highest cases are in school-aged children, 10 to 14-year-olds and 5 to 9-year-olds. And then in terms of adults, the highest adult group is 30 to 59-year-olds. And again, the only age group that's really falling significantly are the over 60s, and that will be a booster effect, which is obviously good news. The infection survey published today, again, confirms this. In fact, they have the highest prevalence by far in children under 11, and it's the highest prevalence in primary school-aged children since the beginning of the pandemic, and the lowest rates by far in the over 70s. And again, that's a booster effect. So Public Health England, or UK Health Security Agency, have been analysing contact tracing data for the last 6 months and looking at if a household gets COVID, which was the first case, how old were they, and then how did it spread within households? And they published this paper yesterday that came out. And what they showed is that the proportion of cases, or the proportion of first cases in a household that were children, went up a lot this term. So this is 12 to 15-year-olds, and this is 5 to 11-year-olds. And the most recent data in the paper is less certain, and this only goes up to the beginning of October, so it misses the big October spikes that we saw. But you can see that this term, really for one of the first times of the pandemic, you're seeing far more cases being brought into households by school-aged children. And they also looked at then what happened. So this is a bit complicated, but this is the age of the first case coming in, and this is the age of secondary cases, so people who look like they were infected by people in their household, by men and women. But basically what the pattern is, that if you have a school-age child who's the first person to get COVID, the people that are then affected tend to be their siblings, so other children and adults, and mainly that's parents, and mainly 40 to 49-year-olds, and then a bit 50 to 59-year-olds. If an adult is the first person to get infected, they do also infect their children and also each other, so kind of their spouse. So that's kind of what you're seeing, is that we've seen more children coming in as the first case in the household, and then it spreads through the household, but that generally households can and do infect each other, particularly with Delta. And what this means is that if we're trying to reduce transmission nationally, it can't just be about things like masks in public spaces. You do have to address where the index cases are getting it. And if it's children, that is school. A lot of it is school. So unless we do something about school transmission, there's a limit to how much we can bring down transmission. Hospitalization and deaths. So this is the number of people in hospital in the UK nations up to yesterday. And I've gone back all the way to the last wave because I wanted to point out that actually, compared to where we were a year ago, which is here, we do now have fewer people in hospital in every nation. And that is entirely because of the boosters, because we've got higher case rates than we had a year ago. So this is good news. It's also good news that over the last few weeks, people in hospital have been falling, particularly in Northern Ireland. And that's partly the booster campaign, and admissions have been falling. However, in England, at least, just over the last week, it looks like that fall in admissions has stopped. I don't know if it's actually going up or not, or whether it's flat, but certainly I would say that it has stopped falling. And when we look at deaths, we're still having, over 100 deaths reported every day, pretty much. And again, over the last week or two, that has been quite flat. So we're not really seeing sustained falls in deaths anymore, unfortunately. On long COVID, so ONS publishes a kind of an update on the number of people who report ongoing COVID symptoms every month. They published their latest one yesterday. I'm just looking at people who reported symptoms for more than 4 weeks, because that brings us closest to the current time. And this is different age groups on the bottom. And then as we go from left to right, you have people who were infected before May, and then people who were infected before October. So it kind of takes into account the summer wave and the beginning of this autumn surge. And basically what you can see is that the kind of age groups where it's going up are children and their parents' generation. And that's kind of reflecting who has been infected most in September and August. And in terms of numbers, it's about 1.2 million people overall in the country. So, a significant proportion of people, the over 70s isn't shown here. And although it is mostly in adults, it is now about 77,000 children under 17 are reporting ongoing symptoms. And unfortunately, that is likely to go up with the high rates that we saw in October. And out of that 1.2 million people, about a third of them have reported having symptoms for more than a year. So on to Omicron. So, it seems like longer, but it was only a week ago that we really first learned about it, and South Africa had their first press briefing about it. It has been spreading and still is spreading very fast in South Africa, particularly in Gauteng province, which is where Johannesburg and Pretoria cities are. And this is a number of reported cases each day in the province, and it's on a log scale, because on a log scale, exponential increases are straight lines, and you can see it a bit more clearly. And these blue dots are Sundays and Mondays, which are the lowest reporting days. So it's not actually falling here, it's just that's a weekend effect. And what you can kind of see is that at the beginning of November, it was going up, but not super rapidly. And that's likely as Omicron was gaining dominance over Delta. It started off being quite a small proportion of cases, and really by the middle of November, it was dominant, and it was most cases in Gauteng. And then since then, you kind of have the purer increase in growth that's due to this variant. And if you can fit an exponential to it, and the main thing here is that since it's been dominant since the middle of November, you're getting an increase, really quite consistent fit here, of 25% growth a day. And that corresponds to 3 to 4 day doubling. And that is what we're seeing in Gauteng province, which is really high. We've not seen that kind of growth in COVID really since the very early days of the pandemic. And if you wanted to look at it on a kind of a normal chart, that's what it looks like. And what you can see is that the early growth is kind of hidden. So it looks like nothing much is happening, and then suddenly it shoots up, but that's exponential growth. And if you compare it to previous waves in South Africa, this is now the 4th wave in South Africa. This is by John Murdoch at the Financial Times. You can see that in terms of cases, positivity rates, and hospital admissions, this wave is quicker, and it's going up quicker. And that's what's worrying. And then in terms of who is testing positive, so it's driven at the moment in Gauteng by younger people, so 10 to 29-year-olds. And so there've been a lot of reports about saying, it's mild. Well, it's mostly infecting younger people who tend to have mild illness with COVID anyway. But also we are seeing increases in hospitalization rates in Gauteng province. This morning, the South African Health Ministry gave an updated press briefing, quite a detailed presentation on Omicron. It was actually extremely good. You can watch it on this YouTube link. And this is one of the things that I found quite worrying. This is the increase in the number of admissions per 100,000 people by age group over time in the Gauteng province. So you can see pretty much all age groups have increased a lot over the last 2 weeks. The highest incidence is in the over 60s. Now that's kind of what we would expect. That's what we see pretty much everywhere with COVID. But the second highest group is the under 5s. And that's never really happened in the pandemic. And there were first some signs of it last week, and I didn't say anything about it because we weren't, it's not clear, is that an artifact? Is there something odd going on? But they made quite a strong point about this in the briefing today, and they spoke about it for 5 to 10 minutes, and they seem quite sure that this is a real thing that they're seeing, even if they don't quite understand why it is. And what they did is they tried to compare COVID-19 admissions in the first 2 weeks of the Delta wave, which is blue, and then the first 2 weeks of this wave in orange in the same city, the city that's been the epicenter of this new wave. And what you can see is that there have been lower rates of admissions in older people. And hopefully that is a combination of vaccination. Hopefully vaccination is protecting people, but also the fact that actually mostly younger people have been affected. But you have seen this big increase in the number of under 5s that have been admitted. Now, the growth in Omicron could be due to a number of things. So whatever reason, it has advantage over Delta, but that can come because it's more infectious, so it's just better at getting into people's bodies, or because it's better at evading your immune system. So it's better at infecting people who've either been vaccinated or already have had COVID, or it can be a combination of increased infectiousness and increased immune evasion. And what you can do is, this is on the x-axis, this is kind of R0, that is a measure of how intrinsically infectious the virus is. And this measure is how good it is at overcoming previous immunity. And so for any given growth, it can be somewhere on a curve between those two things. And at the moment, this is the current R rate in Gauteng province and South Africa, and currently it's about 2.5. It's kind of this white thing. And so what you get, this is a chart done by Trevor Bedford, is that somewhere in this patch is where Omicron sits. And we don't know where, because the data is consistent with it being pretty much anywhere on this spectrum. So it could be way more infectious and only a little bit more better at escaping the immune system than, say, Delta, or it could be less infectious than Delta, but much better at escaping the immune system. And we're in a world now where a lot of people have some immunity, either from infection or vaccination, and that gives you quite a big advantage. So that's what all the experiments are trying to find out right now, is where on this line does Omicron sit, because it matters for our vaccine policy and what our mitigation should be. Now, there was a paper published yesterday from South Africa, and what they're saying is that it actually seems to be immune evasion. It seems to be at the top left of that chart. And they said that it looks as if Omicron can evade immunity from infection with earlier variants and is causing reinfections in South Africa 3 times the previous rate. So this is a plot of reinfections in South Africa, and you can see the steep increase over the last couple of weeks. And they're almost at the level they were in the Delta wave, but at much, much, much lower total case rate. So it looks as if the proportion of cases that are reinfections has gone up a lot in the last few weeks. So what do we know and what don't we know? We absolutely know that Omicron has a great advantage over Delta in South Africa. We know it's spread rapidly. We don't know if it's more severe once you're infected. The advantage does seem to be more from immune escape than infectiousness. And that means that we must rely less on population immunity to prevent growth. So you can't say, well, loads of people have been affected, so we're fine. That's not the case. Now, what we don't know exactly how that fits in with the vaccines. We know that it's seeded in many countries worldwide, including here. I looked today, and at the moment, there are about 60 cases confirmed in the UK. It's likely, but there are probably hundreds here already that we haven't spotted yet. It might be growing rapidly here. If it is, it's not going to be noticeable in daily numbers for a few weeks. And I think experts, Danny and Sheena will talk about this, expect that boosters should still prevent severe illness and death. And that's why we're boosting. But we are still waiting for those results from the first experiments, the vaccine escape, and they should come in a couple of weeks. And they're going to be so important for trying to work out where we are and how bad it is. But the UK context is really different to South Africa. It's a much older population. We have a much older population. We're much more vaccinated and much more boosted, which is really good news. But it is winter here, not summer, and we already have a large Delta wave going on. So anyway, we already have a lot of infection around. So adding to that is probably not a great idea. But the good news that came out yesterday as well is that COVID boosters are really, really good and really strengthen immunity. And again, we'll talk about that a bit later. And it does seem as if the boosters protect you more against other variants, although it's not been tested against Omicron. And just returning to this chart, the UK is probably around here. It might even be back in October. So, we're not in a situation where we're suddenly going to see accelerated growth. We're not, but we might see it in 3 to 4 weeks. And the whole point of what we're trying to do now is stay in this flat bit for as long as possible so we can boost as many people as possible before we get to this stage. And the likelihood is that there will be a point at which we're in this stage. So let's just look at the vaccination data, because it is really crucial now, given the situation. So this is just the people vaccinated by home nation. And you can see that about 30% of people in each home nation have now been fully vaccinated with the booster. It is lower in Northern Ireland, so they're a bit behind, but in the other countries, it is about 30%. But there has been reports today that about 1 in 4 residents in care homes have yet to receive their booster shot, and that is potentially very worrying in the context of Omicron. Sorry. This is the number of vaccine shots given every day. We're currently doing about 350,000 boosters a day, which is good, very good, but we need to get it a bit higher. So we're doing 2.5 million people a week. If we get that to 400 to 420,000 a day, so about 3 million people a week, we can meet the end of January target to boost all eligible adults that the government has set. And really, if every single week we delay the dominance of Omicron, every single week we stay in the flat a bit, we can have millions more people be booster protected. And as Sage was saying today, or this week, the earlier you try and delay things, the easier it is because there's just less of it around. And the other thing is just now that we know that rates are highest in school children, and there is some indication from South Africa that children are a bit more effective, there is, I think, an even stronger case to vaccinate 5 to 11-year-olds. And so we do have to, I would urge JCVI to consider that as soon as they can and as soon as MHRA have approved it. So just to summarise, cases are rising in the UK. They're higher now than they've been since July. It's still driven by school children and their parents' generation. Hospital admissions and deaths were falling, but are now flattish. The latest news from South Africa is that both their cases and their admissions are rising faster than previous waves. And the early indications are that Omicron growth is due to more immune escape rather than increased infectiousness. And there are also some initial worrying signs that under 5s are more affected in this wave. And as I said, every week we can delay Omicron growth, we can boost millions more people. And really, it's easier to do it in the early stages, easier to do it right now, even though it doesn't feel like a problem in the UK yet. So that is my presentation. So I'll stop there. And then I want to kind of go straight on to talking to Danny and Sheena. So Danny is obviously our most recent Indy Stage member and Professor of Immunology at Imperial, and his research is focused on the immunology of infectious diseases. And Sheena Cruikshank is Professor in Biomedical Sciences and Public Engagement at Manchester and an AAS Leshner Fellow in Infectious Disease. And her research focuses on the immune response to infection, injury, and the microbiome. So thank you both for agreeing to kind of explain a little bit more about immunity. So we've heard a lot about it in the news. We've had these discussions about vaccine immunity or infection immunity or both. We've heard about antibodies and T cells and B cells and all the rest of it. But I personally find it all really confusing. So I thought maybe you could kind of talk me through some of it. So firstly, to Sheena, if you're unvaccinated and then get infected with COVID, like how does your body actually like fight off the infection?
So the way your body works when you get infected is it's got 2 stages. So the first stage is about trying to contain the threat. So we've already got what we call innate cells. They're already there. And what they do is they look for damage, they look for germs, they look for anything like that, and they will try and contain it. And they'll use quite generic kind of ways to contain the threat. They'll also help you buy time while they take a bit of information about that, and then they go to the more adaptive, the more intelligent part of the immune response, as it were. And that's carried out by our B cells and our T cells, which are also called lymphocytes. The B cells can make antibodies. These are soluble products that can latch onto virus and stop the virus from getting into cells. They can also latch onto the cells and stop the virus getting in. They can also help other immune cells find the targets for destruction, so it helps other cells do killing. And we also get T cells, and T cells are there to help the B cells do their job, but also there are T cells that can become killer cells. So they can come along and they can fire sort of big holes in infected cells. So that's kind of a very, very, very quick summary of what we do. So the key things is that second response that involves the B and the T cells, that has memory. So if you meet the same germ again many years later, it should react really quickly. You don't have to wait for all that kind of slow instruction process. They know what to do and they will get out there really quickly and do it.
Great. So Danny, if you're vaccinated, how do the vaccines work to protect you against COVID?
Yeah, so similar idea, isn't it? So you've got your B cells and your T cells, and they've got all these receptors on them ready to recognize all the bad things you might encounter out there in your life. And the logic for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines kicked in very early. The logic said that if the kind of Achilles heel of this infection is that to get into your body, it's totally dependent on the spike being able to attach to your human cells. The receptor is called ACE2. If you could block or neutralize that interaction, you'd be okay. So all of the vaccines are essentially of a similar idea, that if you can in a kind of benign and innocent and non-infectious way get a bit of spike into the body, then you could stimulate all those T cells and B cells to make an absolute ton of neutralizing antibody and protective T cells. And when you met the real thing, you'd be forearmed and forewarned and ready to go. And I can only say that I've worked in immunology and vaccinology for many decades, and I'm a big fan of immunology, and I wasn't prepared for how stupendously amazing these vaccines would turn out to be. They were better than my wildest dreams. This was a kind of battle that people had been preparing for years, just in case. And when it came along, all that knowledge kicked into action, and kind of worked.
Sheena, is there anything that you would add to that, or?
No, I think that's a very succinct explanation of what they're trying to do. So basically, they're trying to give you the memory bit without you getting sick in the first place. And that's the crucial thing, because, to develop memory by natural infection, we have to get ill. And that can be the problem, because obviously, as we're seeing with COVID, that can unfortunately result in really serious illness and long COVID. And even if it doesn't, to be honest, I've had COVID, it's not pleasant. It took me a good 2 months to get over it. So yeah, it's
some people have been saying that the immunity you get from having been infected is better than the immunity you get from vaccination. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, so people have looked at this, and this is where you have to get into a little bit more of the immunology. When your immune system meets something, and your B and T cells meet things, they see the virus in slightly different ways, and they've got lots of choices about what they're going to look at on that virus or in that virus. And usually there's quite a dominant response. So you'll see, like, for example, a really big response to the spike protein, as we're seeing in this. But you have got these unfortunate individuals who perhaps won't have immune cells that will make the right choice, because they've got so many things to pick from. But when you give a vaccine, you're giving it a much more targeted set of choices. So that means that you're more likely to have the good immune response to the right thing. And that is one of the advantages. We cannot guarantee that natural immunity is going to do that for everybody, because everybody's immune response is a little bit different and it's affected by all sorts of things. So broadly speaking, we would be concerned about natural immunity versus vaccine-induced immunity. It certainly seems to be all right for most of us, but the huge risk is that you are risking getting really seriously ill, you're risking death, and you're risking long COVID.
Danny, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, and just add on a few words. No, so agree with all of the above. Just to add on, one of my sort of favorite studies that came out early on in the pandemic, when we were all trying to think about this stuff and what would be the quality of immunity you could have in different settings, was a really snazzy study that came out of Amsterdam. So, we all know now that this is a coronavirus and that the near cousins of this coronavirus are the main common cold coronaviruses. And they said, we've got an enormous biobank of stored serum samples. Let's analyze them going back year on year on year for the last 30 years and have a look how much good your immunity is for protecting you from the common cold. Yeah. And you can see where this is headed, that, they analyzed these people and they'd all had the same damn common colds with exactly the same virus year after year after year in perpetuity. So their natural immunity wasn't really buying them any protection. Because coronaviruses are sneaky things that have ways of subverting your immunity and making it suboptimal and making it, making it very unlikely it's going to keep you out of trouble.
So, what was I going to say? So what happens then if you're vaccinated, but then still get COVID, which is now happening to more people? How is that working with the waning? How much does it still protect you? Danny, you want to go first?
I'll do a couple of sentences and then I'll hand over. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
The only reason I'm keen to answer is because we did a lot of work on this, and nobody knew what the answer would be. But when the first cohorts of people came through who'd had their first dose of Pfizer vaccine, we looked at it, and so did everybody else. And the results were absolutely incredible. It's one of those really striking results that scream out at you from your computer, because everybody was doing well with their first dose vaccination, but the people who were down in our cohort as having been prior infected and then having got vaccinated were shifted on the graph upwards by about a factor of about several hundred or 1,000. So there was a kind of synergy, a kind of combined effect of your prior infection and your vaccine that was really kind of turbocharging the immune response. So in a really good way. But I'll shut up and let Sheena say something.
So yeah, no, absolutely. So you do seem to be super immune, and Danny was one of the first people to show that. So that's fantastic. The other thing one of the things that we use when we look at infection is we talk about something called sterilizing immunity, and I think that's one of the phrases that's sort of been bandied around a bit. And what that means in effect is you've got lots and lots of antibody persisting in your body, and we call that neutralizing antibody. So if you get infected, that neutralizing antibody, basically it's like a no entry sign for the viruses. They cannot get into your cells, so you have no apparent infection. You're fine. But what can happen if that falls down, if we don't get that sort of staying up, as long as we've still got memory B cells and memory T cells, is we'll get a little lag before they kick into action. And then they'll kick into action, they'll start killing any virally infected cells, they'll start making lots and lots of neutralizing antibody. So what we see is a less severe infection as a consequence. And that's exactly what we've been seeing with hospitalizations and things, is we are seeing people who've had the 2 vaccines, and of course now the boosters, are getting less severe infection if they get infected.
So what's happening now in the UK is that people who are 4 or 5 months out from their second infection can't sterilize it anymore, so they can get infected, but then in theory it gives them a head start and they get better quicker. Is that the idea? Yeah,
that's exactly it.
And kind of, does it depend on what vaccine you've had? Like, is there a big difference between AstraZeneca and Pfizer? Like, Danny, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll start. So it comes back to what I was saying before about what a fan I am of these vaccines. So at the beginning, when we didn't have any vaccines and we were watching all the Downing Street briefings, and we were hearing how many billions of pounds had been invested in booking into potential future vaccines, I was getting very cross and up on my high horse that they didn't know anything about these vaccines, and whether they were going to be any good or which ones were better or worse. And they were talking about them like they were buying sweeties from the sweetie shop or something, without knowing anything about them. And they were kind of right and I was kind of wrong, because they all turned out to be absolutely amazing. And in our lab, for example, we did a big meta-analysis of every single property of every single vaccine. Nowadays in the world, I think there are 24 in use, but there's probably about another 100 coming around the bend. and some of them are a bit better on the neutralizing antibodies, and some of them are a bit better on the T cells. But all the ones that anybody out there has heard of, and certainly all the ones in use in the UK, absolutely do the job and do it well. And I think the challenge now, we all talk all the time, don't we, about global equity to vaccine access and none safe till we're all safe. And for my taste, part of that is where the other 100 vaccines come in, that we're kind of on the verge of being able to produce amazing ones all around the world. And that'll be the big answer. And that'll be such a big answer.
So Sheena, just where do the boosters fit into this then? How does that third dose help?
What the third dose is doing is basically giving our immune system a little bit of a reminder of what it's got to do. And that enables us to start making the neutralizing antibodies again and really gets our memory response going again. So when you look at data, and I think it just came out last night or this morning, what they saw much higher levels of neutralizing antibodies. So that means you're more likely to get sterilizing immunity. And they also saw evidence that we were getting more memory immune cells as well. So it really seems to be oomping up your immune response. I guess the only question we don't definitively know at the moment is how long the booster effects will last, but we should be confident, at least from what we've seen from just the second dose vaccines, that we should still have a degree of immunity. So at worst, in 4 or 5 months' time, we'll be back to that kind of, we're still partially protected.
Okay, great. So last question before public questions, and maybe Danny, you can answer this, is how does Omicron fit into the kind of vaccine and booster landscape?
Well, it's all hard to say at the moment, isn't it? But, as you were saying in your whiz through the data, if you're trying to narrate the story of Omicron, it's like any of the variants we've been through, isn't it? But it's going to be to do with trying to understand what's different about severity, what's different about transmission, and what's different about immune evasion. And people are racing to tell all those stories in real time. Most people are trying to do it, if they can, over the next few weeks. And what I feel, this is just speculation when I look at the data, is so I was one of the people who was going on the telly at the end of last week saying how scared I was because I was eyeballing those mutations and seeing 32 different mutations all in the kind of business end that the antibodies bind to, compared to Delta, which had 10, which was the worst one I knew so far, and thinking, maybe we were going to be scuppered on our protective immunity from our vaccines. And I think maybe I was being too speedy and too naive. And maybe it isn't playing out like that, because already the reports from South Africa are that people getting hospitalized are, again, overwhelmingly the unvaccinated, not the vaccinated, as if their residual vaccine immunity, even in Omicron, is buying them some protection. And my assumption is that if one can get people boosted so they've really got their sky-high antibody levels, I always talk about this concept of protective headroom, about how far your antibodies could drop before you're in trouble. If you've got, levels of antibody in the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, if they drop 30 or 40 because of the mutant, you're still okay. And that's where I think we have to get to. And I think most people who've been boosted are hopefully in the safe zone. Okay.
Sheena, is there anything you want to add before we go to questions?
Yeah, we certainly hope so. I mean, we still don't definitively know how it's going to pan out with its sort of evasion strategies. One of the evasion strategies that might prove a little bit challenging for the immune system is they think it might be affecting the way that the receptor looks, so the spike protein shape might be a little bit different. And what antibodies do is they actually see shapes. So they actually lock onto targets like jigsaw pieces. So you get a nice perfect match with two perfect jigsaw pieces. And so it might be that they can't bind as tightly because there's a big gap in the jigsaw piece, or they might not be able to bind as much. But hopefully we've got enough of a range of antibodies that we still have some protection as well. And obviously we've still got the T cells that won't be affected by those changes. So that is good news again for the vaccines and the boosters.
Great. Well, thank you for the whistle-stop tour through immunology. And now back to Alice for some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, that was utterly brilliant. It was a masterclass, and what was fascinating about it was that it was a masterclass in as an introduction to immunology, but also bringing us right up to date on what we know about vaccines and boosters. So thank you, because there are so many immunological words bandied around, reported on the news every day, and there's something very black box about it. People are using these words without actually knowing what they refer to, and I think that you have helped to you've helped to take the myth away, and you've helped to actually show people that these are real things we're talking about. Brilliant jigsaw analogy. Thank you, Danny and Sheena and Christina as well. Moving on now to questions from the press and the public. The first one comes in from Richard Harrison. Richard, what's your question?
Hello, everybody. My question is, I'll just get the words up here, is what is Independent Sage's advice to those planning family gatherings this Christmas?
Thank you very much. I think that Independent Sage doesn't explicitly advise people, but we would have maybe helpful suggestions. So family gatherings this Christmas. I know what I'm doing. I'm moving it all outside. I did that last year and I'm doing it again. What's everybody else doing? What should the advice be? Professor Martin McKee, because I come to you first.
Yeah, you know what, when asked about all of these things, I always go back to basics, which is to say this is a virus which is transmitted in crowded indoor spaces where people are gathered together. And therefore, at any time during the pandemic, you should avoid those. And particularly when we have a new and potentially much more transmissible variant. So I'm not going to go to any parties in person. We will be together as a family, which we are anyway. But I don't expect to be putting any of us at risk in any other way. And I'm afraid I'm a bit too old for snogging under the mistletoe, which I know there's an intensive debate about at the minute.
Yeah, snogging rather than thinking about it as an airborne disease. I thought that was very odd. It seems to be advice about cold sores rather than advice about COVID, but there you go. Anybody else then? Christmas parties, what do you think about those? Professor Dean and Pillay.
I agree with Martin. Of course, all parties are not the same, and the different size. I mean, the university that some of us work in at UCL have advised strongly not to have departmental Christmas parties, for instance, that would be traditional. I've also been invited to some smaller events over the next couple of weeks, and I'm suggesting, but also those people are also instigating having lateral flow tests before coming, and obviously having as much ventilation as possible and limiting the size. So there's a whole range of things, and but I must say I don't want, because Indie Sage doesn't have a position, I don't want us to be characterized as prevaricating in the way that the government is prevaricating. It is these are very sensible suggestions. And I would prefer the government to be able to lay those out very clearly, that here are the sorts of things, as Martin said, it's an airborne infection. We know these things are the risks, and here are the ways you mitigate those risks. But of course, we're all in slightly different positions, and meeting long lost family and so forth, where we just also need to know what are the ways in which we can meet people, but in the safest possible way.
Thank you, Dina and Christina.
So just on my family Christmas, we were planning on spending it with my parents, who are both extremely vulnerable, and my sister's family. And I saw my mum this weekend, did a lateral flow test beforehand, and she actually is quite worried about it. And so I think what we'll do is we'll decide much closer to the time when we know more about Omicron. But we will be doing lateral flow tests and trying to be safe that way. In terms of Christmas parties, I personally think there's so much benefit to delaying the rise of Omicron that I think it's not a good idea now. For individuals, if you test positive, if you get infected, probably not beginning of next week, but by the end of next week, you might well risk having to isolate over Christmas. So just bear that in mind. There's a lot of COVID around. People who are coming up to their booster but haven't been boosted yet have more chance of being infected. As Sheena was explaining, you're probably not going to get very sick, but you might still get a bit sick and have to isolate. So there is just the risk of missing Christmas if you go out for a party on the 18th of December. So just think about that. as well.
Thank you, Christina. And thank you for that question, Richard. Another question now from Lucy Watson. Lucy.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm a parent of 2 primary school children, and I'm very concerned about the potential long-term health impacts of COVID infection in unvaccinated kids. In fact, I'm actually so concerned about it that I did kick off a petition 10 days ago on the Parliamentary Petitions website around accelerating access for that age group. But then, of course, we had Omicron come on the scene literally a couple of days afterwards. So you have actually answered some of my questions around how that should impact the rollout. But I had one specific area which I don't think has been addressed, which is, right around I'm in an area which is significantly above average in the UK. Kids around me are dropping like flies. And so they're potentially getting Delta today. And yet in a few short weeks, presumably Omicron is going to be prevalent, it's going to become dominant. So surely they're at risk of falling ill again in very quick succession. And how worried should I be about that as a parent? What could that do to their bodies? And I guess even theoretically, that could almost become concurrent for a small number of children. So, how concerned we should be about that, and how should that affect the vaccine rollout?
Thank you very much, Lucy. I wondered, Danny, if this is a question for you, and what you think about that possibility of being reinfected with another strain quite quickly, or perhaps even having a co-infection with the 2 strains.
Yeah, so there's lots of things to unpack in that question, aren't there? So I'll try and do them really briefly so that other people can have a chance. First thing to say is that although we know that the different variants are immunologically different, and we just published a paper on it last night. And in general, my prediction would be that if you had high levels of newly boosted immunity generated by Delta, I'd probably bet my house on that seeing you through for protection also against Omicron. To a degree, with that slight sort of quashing of the response. So I hope that rapid reinfection wouldn't be a special thing for Omicron. I do think the thing was mentioned before that we're so desperate to see the JCVI come down and say something about vaccine rollout for the lower age group, and I think we're all in agreement that all those truisms we had from the beginning about how children aren't affected or it doesn't matter or whatever, we've really got to get rid of those, because they really are affected. It really does matter, and the caseload of long COVID is really a tragedy for them and their education.
Thank you so much, Danny. Zubaida, Dr. Zubaida Haque.
It's a really good question, Lucy, and I think you have every right to be concerned. And I think that concern should also be for secondary school children, because right now we have an appalling situation where children have the highest infection rates. They are either partially vaccinated, like 12 to 15-year-olds, or not vaccinated at all, and yet they're the most exposed, and they have the fewest mitigations. And literally, I found it extraordinary last weekend when Boris Johnson was saying in the same breath that children have the highest infection rates, and yet didn't say anything at all about new mitigations to be introduced in schools, apart from face masks for secondary school children in corridors only, as though the virus knows when to stop at a classroom door. And I think that's really, really concerning. And it's concerning because, and I was thinking this about Danny and Sheena's excellent conversation, that, the boosters are the solution to some extent with Omicron, but where does that leave children? Where does that leave children? And where does that leave single dose children? And even in my daughter's school, who's in secondary school, children who had the vaccination in October are being reinfected again now. So it's really concerning, and basically it goes down to this one message, which is we cannot have a vaccine-only approach. We cannot have that generally, because boosters are going to take a long time before we have full rollout by the end of January. And we cannot do that in schools because we're not moving fast enough. We haven't even had a decision about under 11-year-olds. So we need more mitigations in schools. We need the carbon dioxide monitors in all of the schools. We need the HEPA filters. We need social distancing. We need face masks in secondary school everywhere. We need face masks possibly also for year 5 and 6 in primary schools. That all needs to be escalated right now. We cannot go on as we are with schools at the moment. Children are utterly unprotected.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yvonne. And Helen, Dr. Helen Salisbury.
I just wanted to add to that on schools. I have been such a Grinch this last week, but I've been asked many times about carol concerts and about outings to the pantomime, whole school outings to the pantomime. And I can't think of situations in which you're more guaranteed to spread the virus than with hundreds of kids packed into an auditorium, all shouting, "Look behind you," or a whole concert and all their parents and grandparents singing their heart out to Christmas carols. I love all that stuff. It's brilliant. But it is also the way that you're going to spread this virus more widely. And unfortunately, I just think we shouldn't be doing it now.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's sad, isn't it? I mean, I think that's the awful thing as we approach the Christmas holidays. This is a time of festivities. This is a time when, you know, we're used to precious memories being made, and it is desperately sad, but we just have to face up to reality. Sheena, I wondered if you wanted to comment here as well.
Well, I think I just agree with everything everybody said. It's really disappointing that decisions haven't been announced yet, even for the second doses. We're still not there with the second doses for our high school children, and we know that the first dose is just not enough to protect them. And other countries are already vaccinating their under 12s. I don't know why we're taking so long to decide. I don't even know why we took so long to decide with our 12 to 17-year-olds, to be honest. And we know that there's still some issues with vaccine coverage with the first doses in some parts yet. So this is an area that we should be tackling. And it's also not very fair on the staff that work in schools and the teachers and cleaners and etc. who are there left vulnerable with these children who might be unintentionally infecting them.
Thank you very much, Sheena. I mean, I don't know what parents can do to try to raise awareness of this and try to just encourage, I suppose, the government to think about our children a bit more. I mean, it seems that we have very powerful voices that are against any mitigations in schools, which just means that they're left open to infection, and that impinges on their education as well. Thank you very much for that question, Lucy. Moving on now to Jen Riddleston. Jen, what's your question?
Hi, my dog is going mad in the background. I apologise.
I was going to say we're not used to canine questions on Independence Age, but you are a human. What's your question?
So my question is about those of us who are immunocompromised, and what sort of precautions should we be taking? And I'd just like to add on to that I have children, and obviously the risks of them being in school. What sort of precautions should people who are immunocompromised be taking at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Who would like to start with this then? I mean, we've talked very broadly about precautions. And Deanan summed up some of the precautions that we can all take to make ourselves safer. What about people who are immunocompromised? Who would like to start with that? I'm going to pick somebody. I might pick Martin. I'm going to pick Martin.
Well, thank you very much. I was really going to hope that you would pick on Danny, actually, or Sheena, because I think that they can provide a much more detailed technical guide. I mean, the principles are the same as ever. And I keep going back to first principles, but I think I would prefer to pass that one over to Danny, perhaps. Sorry.
All right, then.
Shall I get the ball rolling? Lots of studies now, we've done loads, other people have done them as well, looking at every possible population of immunocompromised patients, both people with, born with immunodeficiencies and people on drugs that make them immune compromised. And again, I've been surprised and impressed by the fact that even if you're precluded from making a good immune response the first time you see the vaccine, by the time you get to the second time and certainly the third time, I've been so impressed by how those responses zoom up. So my simplest kind of idiot professor answer would be the best thing you can do is just make sure that you and everybody you know is boosted, because those levels will go up, and compromise or no, that's protection. So that's my simple answer. But I'll give way to people who've got fancier answers or additional answers.
But Danny, that's brilliant. I mean, it's brilliant that we know that, and how reassuring, Jen, to know that actually, even though it starts off slowly, by the time you get to second and third doses, you've really got some protection kicking in. That's fantastic. Dr. Zubaydah Haq.
Can I just add, from a non-medical perspective, that I don't just think it's your responsibility alone to look after yourself. We're in a pandemic. The government has a responsibility to look after the public. And at the moment, I'm quite dismayed that the government has taken a very one-size-fits-all approach to this pandemic and has essentially sent the message that we should carry on partying as though there's no tomorrow. It's good to have lots of festive parties, according to the government. And of course, we know that they did that last year during Christmas, while the rest of us were adhering to the lockdown rules. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important that the government do a lot more to protect not just immunocompromised people. We also need to understand that about a fifth of the population are disabled. And they're not necessarily immunocompromised, they don't necessarily have underlying health issues, but they're disabled, which means that when cases are extremely high, like they are right now, yesterday we had about 54,000 cases reported on December the 2nd. It means that a lot of people feel that they need to shield, feel that they need to stay indoors because there's too much virus circulating. So the government have a responsibility, I think, to help people like yourself to bring cases down right now so that you can go out, you can enjoy yourselves as well.
Thank you very much, Zubaydah, for that incredibly important point. And thank you, Jen, for your question. Moving on now to another questioner, Paul Tabush. Paul, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'm aware that my question is rather from a different point of view from the previous conversations, because I'm interested in how the virus biology acts, and I'm puzzled about the mechanisms for the replacement of one variant by another. So my question is it possible to be infected by more than one variant simultaneously? And if not, how do variants exclude each other? If, on the other hand, that's not true, how does a more infectious variant outcompete its predecessors? Is it just a quantitative effect? And if so, does this mean that Delta will disappear quickly in the face of the more infectious Omicron?
Thank you very much, Paul. Sheena, I wonder if you'd like to start with that one.
So that, again, there's quite a lot in that question. What happens is viruses always mutate, that's natural. And the reason that they're mutating is as much as anything to see if they can, just do a little bit better. In some ways, the actual perfect pathogen, perfect virus, would be one that could get to live inside its host because it needs us. We're its source of everything. It can't replicate without us. But then not really damage us. So it could kind of stealthily just be inside us and then whip between people and transmit really well. But that doesn't necessarily the case as to what happened. But what you see is that basically it's evolution. So when you get a virus that can, say, be more transmissible, it's got an advantage over the others. So ultimately it'll win out against the others because it's just doing a bit better. So it will become the dominant strain. You've got a virus that's more able to hide from the immune system, which means it can stay inside us a bit longer, and that's its home. That also is an advantage. So again, it will outcompete. So it's just a bit like a competition between different different strains, and sometimes there's an energy cost. So sometimes you'll see a variant emerge in a virus or another type of germ, and it'll cost so much energy to the germ to try and do that, whatever that change is, that ultimately it's just not beneficial. So that one will die out naturally as well. So there's all sorts of clever evolutionary things going. Of course, it's the arms race as well, because we are putting a huge selection pressure on those viruses, because we're trying to stop them transmit, hopefully, by wearing masks and things, so they can't get into people to try and do that. And we're giving this huge boost to our immune system, and our immune system's got loads and loads of different strategies that it's using to try and squash down these viruses. So you have lots of selection pressures on the virus. So I think I've maybe partially answered your question.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Danny, I think you've published something about this quite recently, haven't you?
Yeah, I certainly have. In fact, we published something about it last night. But a really interesting question. All I'd add quickly to Sheena's answer is your question actually had at least two bits in it, didn't it? One was, could there be competition between two sequences in one person? And the other was the sort of population level thing. I think everything's possible. Because in most people, most of the time, the virus doesn't hang around that long. I'm hoping that there won't be people getting infected by multiple viruses at once. But God knows, anything's possible. But I think the big answer for the pandemic is the other thing that Sheena was talking about, that I think we all thought that Delta was kind of peak variant and it'd be very, very hard to displace it. And we're all just looking over the coming weeks to see whether that's still true, or whether Omicron is going to be able to displace it. And we'll have to wait and see.
So it could be that Omicron is the death of Delta.
Yeah.
Paul, thank you very much for that fascinating question, and thank you for those fascinating answers. Now we've got a question from John Pitts. John.
Thank you. Mine is to do with mutation of the virus. And we may have touched on it a little bit already, but here goes. My question is this: how does a virus know how and when to mutate? Animals might respond to climate change by shedding thick coats or migrating. They're basically adapting to conditions that they can feel directly, whereas viruses exist and propagate inside our bodies. So how do they get information from the outside world that the current strain is losing its impact and therefore change is necessary?
Thank you very much, John. I might start with that from a position of evolutionary biology and then hand it over to my immunological expert colleagues. But essentially, no organisms are able to adapt in that kind of foresighted way. So it is all down to random mutations, which sometimes the way we talk about evolution implies that animals are adapting by growing warmer coats. And I think that there can be a bit of it's important to draw a distinction between physiological adaptation, which happens during your lifetime, which is kind of inbuilt, and you have that ability to adapt to your environment. And then evolutionary adaptation, which is about random mutations. And with those, they are random. So they just appear in our genomes over time, and you start piling them up as soon as, even before you're born, there'll be mutations in your genome. And some of those mutations will make no difference at all. Some of them will be deleterious. They'll have a negative effect. Some of them will have a positive effect. And then it's down to the interaction between the organism and its environment in all sorts of ways that then weeds out. So that's what natural selection does. So natural selection then works on those random mutations so that you end up with the beneficial variants rising to the fore. But when those mutations happened, if they had a mind of their own, they had no idea that they were going to be beneficial. So there is no foresight. I mean, this is the tricky thing about evolution. I think it's the tricky thing about the way we talk about it as well. But maybe I can hand over to an immunologist now. Sheena?
I think you've answered absolutely perfectly, to be honest, Alice. I don't think there's anything really much more I could add to that. It really is just that kind of throw of the dice, and does it make it, spread a little faster, jump into another cell a little quicker? If it doesn't, it's just, it's not going to be a mutation that is advantageous to it. And I think, they don't know where this or how this is managed to manifest with such a kind of sort of array of mutations, because it's got a lot of mutations, this new strain. There have been some postulations, some ideas that it's come from somebody who was immunosuppressed and had a chronic infection, and that allowed it to sort of have an environment that enabled its change. There's also been some ideas it's come from an animal reservoir, and it's crossed into human species, and that's why we're seeing some of these new mutations. They're researching that. We don't know yet, but it's I think Alice definitely gave you the perfect answer there.
Thank you, Sheena. And thank you very much for that question, John. Let's move on to Sue Field. Sue. Only just. Yeah, if there's any way of moving closer to your microphone, that would be brilliant.
Oh, I'm not sure. We're hearing so much about the Omicron variant, but are there any statistics about hospitalizations and deaths, especially in the UK, Europe, the USA? Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So the question was, we're hearing a lot about Omicron and how it's increasing rapidly, but is there any evidence yet of increasing hospitalizations, which obviously are going to lag behind the increase in cases? Christina, you talked a little bit about this at the beginning. Would you like to pick up Sue's question?
Yes, so yes, there is evidence of increasing hospitalizations. So in Gauteng province, over the last 2 weeks, they've gone up sixfold. And you could see from one of the graphs I showed that the increased hospitalizations is quicker than previous waves. Now, what is making people feel a little bit better is that the increase in hospitalizations is not as big as the increase in cases. But what we don't know is firstly, as you say, they lag by about a week. And secondly, that currently it's affecting a younger population. So you would see fewer hospitalizations, and the South African ministry today said that it is now starting to go into the older age groups. So we don't know. Certainly there's no indication that it's disastrous, or that it's not, doesn't seem to be indication that it's much worse, but at the moment, so it's either going to be a bit better or about the same as current strains, I think, but I don't know that.
But it is rising very quickly.
It is rising very quickly in Gauteng, yes.
Zubaida.
Can I just add that I'm a little bit concerned about the impact of Omicron on the ethnic minority communities in UK, as well as, of course, on disabled communities and the immunocompromised. And the reason I am is because Black and ethnic minority communities are on average much younger. So we know about a third of school populations, primary and secondary school populations, are Black and ethnic minority children who will be predominantly unvaccinated. And so what I'm concerned about in the next couple of weeks, and this goes back to that initial question about what should we be doing around Christmas time, should we be having big gatherings, is with Black and ethnic minority communities in particular, who we know are quite vulnerable. We know that certainly in the first and second waves, there's been higher deaths, particularly among Bangladeshi, Pakistani and Black African groups. But because the children are unvaccinated, even if they've had a single jab, they're much more likely to get Omicron, perhaps much more likely, and much more likely to be taking it back to their homes, which are also much more likely to be overcrowded and so on. So I think I am quite concerned about the impact on that group.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. And thank you for that question. Let's squeeze in another couple of questions before the end. Gary Hatt.
Hello, good afternoon. I must admit, I've really enjoyed what I've been listening to on this anyway. It's been very good. Thank you for inviting me anyway.
Thank you.
My question is regarding the boosters. Is there any potential risk regarding the boosters being ineffective against the Omicron variant?
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much, Gary. Sheena, what do we feel about the boosters and Omicron at the moment?
Well, I guess we don't know if there's going to be much of a kind of dip in immunity from the vaccines. However, we are confident that the vaccines are performing quite well against Omicron, because when we look at the data from South Africa, it's predominantly the unvaccinated that are getting hospitalized. So at worst, we would worry that we might get a bit of a loss in effectiveness of the vaccines because they're not quite as effective against this strain, but we would still get at least some protection, so we're much less likely to get severe disease. But we don't definitively know yet. Those studies are happening at the moment.
Thank you very much, Sheena. Dina, and I wonder if you had anything to add at this point on this question of Omicron and our protection against it.
I mean, I would just, we've heard the sort of the definitive answers really from Sheena and Danny with regard to and without wanting in any way to use words that may appear as sort of highfalutin and so on. The breadth of the immune response that is being, in other words, the ability of the immune response to deal with these slight variations that these variants have, seem to be holding up, as I think Danny has said, pleasantly surprised that even though these vaccines, which are based on trying to get an immune response against the original, what's called the Wuhan strain, that was the original strain of SARS-CoV-2. In fact, our immune systems are all pretty clever and complicated, and in so doing, provide that sort of broader response. And so I'm reassured by experts such as Danny and Sheena being reassured. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I am totally, and what a huge relief, because when this variant first appeared on the horizon, I think the really big worry was that it was going to escape our vaccines, and so it is a huge relief. But I do think it does, it is a relief. But on the other hand, what it does surely is it should galvanize us to get the world vaccinated, because another variant could come along that could be the really worrying one. Danny, I'm sure you'd agree.
Yeah, I don't know how to keep saying it often enough and loud enough that wanting to get the world vaccinated honestly isn't a piece of wishy-washy liberal altruism. You can regard it as self-interest, if you like, that as long as there are trillions of copies of virus in billions of lungs in the world, none of us are safe.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. We've covered some amazing ground this lunchtime. Thank you ever so much, Sheena, for being with us. And thank you to all of the scientists of Independent Sage who are all volunteers here as ever, and solidarity to those who are striking today and not with us, including Professor Susan Mickey and Stephen Reicher. Thank you to everybody watching as well, and to those of you who've contributed questions today. Thank you very much. All of Independent Sage's reports are available on the website. Do follow us on Twitter if you don't already, and send us in your questions ready for next week, where we'll be back, same time, same place. Stay safe, everybody. Keep well.
Thanks. Bye-bye.